Imagine the world ends tomorrow. The power grid fails, supply chains collapse, cities empty. Everything you depend on, the grocery store, the hospital, the internet, the running water, disappears overnight. Modern civilization, the entire structure you have built your life inside, is gone. Now ask yourself honestly, how long would you last? Most modern humans, if they are being truthful, would not last long. Not because they are weak or stupid, but because the skills required to survive in a world without infrastructure, finding food, purifying water, reading terrain, tracking animals, building shelter, navigating without maps, identifying which plants will kill you and which will save you, are skills that have been systematically outsourced over the last 10,000 years. You do not need them. So you never learned them. And your body, which is still running the same hardware as your prehistoric ancestors, has been sitting in an office chair instead of using it. But your ancient ancestors? They were built for exactly this. Not metaphorically, not in some romantic, idealized sense. Literally, physiologically, neurologically, and socially, built for a world without infrastructure. Because that was every world they had ever known. For roughly 300,000 years before the agricultural revolution, Homo sapiens survived without cities, without farming, without writing, and without any of the systems modern humans now consider essential. They did it not by luck, but by being extraordinarily well adapted to conditions that would currently feel like a catastrophe. So let us run the scenario. The apocalypse arrives. Day 1. What happens to you? And what would have happened to them? Your first problem is water. The average modern human can survive approximately 3 days without it. You probably know where your tap is. You may not know where the nearest clean water source is, how to identify one by reading the landscape, how to follow animal trails to find it, or how to purify it without equipment. Your ancient ancestors knew all of these things instinctively. Not because they were smarter, but because this knowledge was the difference between life and death. And it was learned, practiced, and passed down with the same seriousness that modern humans transmit reading and mathematics. Anthropologist Richard Wrangham at Harvard has studied the cognitive demands of hunter-gatherer life extensively. He argues that the environmental knowledge required to live off the land is staggeringly complex, comparable, in cognitive terms, to completing a medical degree. Your ancestors were not primitive. They were experts. Experts in a domain that has now been almost entirely forgotten. Your second problem is food. You are hungry within hours. You probably know how to use a stove. You may not know how to track an animal, read its prints, anticipate its behavior, set a snare, identify edible plants in your local environment, or process a carcass without tools. Your ancient ancestors could do all of this. Their entire economy was built on it. The Hadza people of Tanzania, one of the last remaining hunter-gatherer societies studied by researchers today, demonstrate the depth of this knowledge. They can identify hundreds of plant species by sight, track animals across rocky terrain, and locate water in a dry landscape using cues that would be completely invisible to the modern eye. But survival is not only about individual skill. It is about social structure. And this is where your ancient ancestors had perhaps their most significant advantage. Dunbar, the British anthropologist famous for his research on social cognition, has shown that humans evolved to live in groups of roughly 20 to 50 people, small enough to know everyone deeply, large enough to share labor, defend against threats, and pool knowledge. In a hunter-gatherer band, every person had a defined role. The best tracker? Tracked. The best healer? Healed. The best fire starter? Made fire. The group survived not because any one individual was exceptional, but because the group itself was a finely tuned survival machine. Modern humans, by contrast, are extraordinarily isolated. The average person in a city knows their neighbors' names, but not their skills. In an apocalyptic scenario, the social bonds that your ancient ancestors relied on, deep, reciprocal, trust-based relationships built over years of shared survival, would be almost entirely absent. You would be alone in a crowd of strangers. Your ancestors were rarely alone at all. Then there is the physical dimension. Anthropologist Daniel Lieberman at Harvard has spent years studying the bodies of hunter-gatherers and comparing them to modern sedentary humans. The results are striking. Hunter-gatherers walked between 9 and 15 kilometers every day as a baseline. They carried loads. They climbed, crouched, sprinted, and recovered. Their cardiovascular systems, musculoskeletal frames, and metabolic profiles were extraordinarily robust by modern standards. Not because they were genetically different, they were not, but because their bodies were used the way bodies were designed to be used. A modern human dropped into a survival scenario would face not just a skills gap, but a physical gap. Blisters within hours, muscle failure within days, joints that have never been asked to work under real load suddenly being asked to carry everything. Your ancient ancestors would not have these problems, not because they were superhuman, but because they had spent their entire lives building exactly the physical resilience that the scenario demands. And then there is the psychological dimension. Modern humans are, by evolutionary standards, extraordinarily poor at managing uncertainty. Research by neuroscientist Sonia Lupien at the University of Montreal has shown that the modern brain responds to unpredictability and loss of control with the same cortisol stress response that was designed for short-term acute threats: a predator, a physical danger, a sudden crisis. When that uncertainty becomes chronic, when the threat does not resolve, the system breaks down. Anxiety, depression, paralysis. Your ancient ancestors lived with uncertainty as a permanent condition. They did not know if the hunt would succeed. They did not know if the dry season would end. They did not know if the child would survive the fever. And yet, they functioned. Because their nervous systems had been calibrated over hundreds of thousands of years to tolerate ambiguity without collapsing. The psychological resilience that modern self-help books try to teach in weekend workshops was, for your ancestors, simply the baseline requirement for being alive. There is one area where modern humans have a significant advantage: accumulated knowledge. 2,000 years of agriculture, hundreds of years of medicine, the germ theory of disease, the ability to read, writing itself, the technology of storing knowledge outside the human brain. If civilization collapsed tomorrow, the people most likely to rebuild it fastest would be those who could access and apply that accumulated knowledge. A modern doctor who survives the first week knows things about infection, sanitation, and trauma care that would have seemed miraculous to a prehistoric healer. But surviving the first week? That is the problem. And in the first week, in the first month, in the raw, infrastructure-free conditions of a true collapse, the advantage belongs overwhelmingly to the person who knows how to read the land, trust their group, move their body, and tolerate the unbearable uncertainty of not knowing what comes next. That person is not you. That person is the version of you that existed 300,000 years ago, before cities, before farming, before the long, comfortable, skill-destroying miracle of civilization made survival someone else's problem. You are still that person underneath everything. The hardware has not changed. The operating system has. And in an apocalypse, it is the hardware that keeps you alive. Your ancient ancestors did not just survive a world without infrastructure. They thrived in it. For 300,000 years. They raised children in it. They built art, language, music, and meaning in it. They were not waiting to be rescued by the future. They were the future, carrying everything humanity needed to survive inside their bodies, their groups, and their minds. The apocalypse would not be the end of the human story. It would be a return to the conditions under which most of that story was written. And somewhere inside you, in the parts of your nervous system that still scan for threats, in the muscles that still remember how to move, in the social instincts that still reach for connection when the world goes dark, your ancestors are still there, waiting for you to remember what you already know.